Hey everyone, this is an entry from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. It's titled French Trotskyism During World War II. French Trotskyism remained seriously divided throughout most of World War II. It was not until February 1944 that the most important factions of the movement were brought back together in a single group. In the interim, the two rival organizations which existed at the time of the outbreak of the war were subdivided into at least 5 during most of the period. All of the Trotskyist groups continued to be active throughout the war. They fought against the successive French governments of the period and against the German occupying power. One of the factions made a heroic but exceedingly dangerous effort to spread the message of international working-class revolutionary solidarity among the occupying German troops. All factions continued their hostility toward the French Communist Party, although continuing to support the cause of the Soviet Union as a worker state. The list of French Trotskyist martyrs, some executed by the Germans, others physically eliminated by the Stalinists in the underground, was a long one, particularly for such a tiny group. All Trotskyist groups were convinced that World War II was going to be followed by a cataclysmic collapse of international capitalism and by the long-hoped-for, quote, political revolution, end quote, against the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union. Their mistaken assessment of the nature of the struggle and of its likely outcome was a principal cause of the inability of the Trotskyists to take advantage of the, quote, opportunities, end quote, created for them by World War II. The Trotskyists during the, quote, phony war. The Nazi war machine attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, thus starting the Second World War. 2 days later, the French and British officially declared war on Germany. However, between September 1939 and April 1940, there was very little military activity on the Western Front, and this period went down in history as that of the, quote, phony war, end quote. This was a period of great confusion and considerable disorganization insofar as the French Trotskyists were concerned. On the one hand, they suffered from the fact that most males of military age were mobilized into the armed forces. On the other, even before the war began, the French government had imposed severe limitations on civil liberties, and soon thereafter the Communist Party was outlawed. The police raided headquarters not only of the Stalinists, but also of other left-wing groups. Many radicals of all stripes being arrested and subjected to prosecution and incarceration. Many Trotskyists were included. Jacques Pluet Desbatins has noted concerning the impact of the outbreak of war on the Trotskyists that, quote, as Trotsky had foreseen in April 1939, the war made the two organizations lose 2/3 of their militants, who were dispersed, isolated, mobilized, or arrested, end quote. Jean-Pierre Cassar has also noted of the Trotskyists that, quote, as a group, they maintained themselves, but with difficulty. The contacts with the provinces were broken. Bourgeois repression curbed them. The extreme youth of the militants meant that they were mobilized. Dozens of Trotskyists were rounded up in the process of general mobilization, ... Most of the mobilized Trotskyist militants only rejoined their organizations after the debacle, end quote, of May-June 1940. Lutte both major Trotskyist factions maintained a semblance of organization. The ex-Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste, which until shortly before the outbreak of the war had been the official French section of the Fourth International, remained split until after the phony war between those who had entered the PSOP of Marcel Pivert and those who had not. The latter group, headed by Marcel and David Rousset maintained a separate group until August 1940. Meanwhile, the Trotskyists of the POI who were within the PSOP argued at a meeting of the Permanent Administrative Committee, CAP, of that organization on August 31st, 1939, that the PSOP should go underground. This motion was defeated, and it was decided that the PSOP would continue as a legal party and maintain its legal newspaper, Juin 36. Only 4 issues of the monthly periodical were able to appear thereafter, all of them heavily censored by the authorities. The last issue was for January-February 1940. After that date, the party, for all practical purposes, disappeared. The Trotskyists, in the meanwhile, had decided to break PSOP discipline and go underground, quote, although maintaining some contacts with the legal organization, end quote. On September 1st, they established a new group, the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale. I don't know how to say fourth in French, but it's the italics. Not the italics, Roman numerals. It soon began to publish an underground newspaper, Les Étincelles, and also put out one issue during the phony war period of Les Bulletins du Comité pour la... Sorry, I reread a sentence. Oh, no, I'm not. It soon began to publish an underground newspaper, Les Étincelles, and also put out one issue during the phony war period of Les Bulletins du Comité pour la Fourth Internationale, apparently designed to be the, quote, theoretical, end quote, journal of the group. As a consequence of these actions, the CAP of the PSOP decided at a further meeting on November 20th, 1939, to exclude all of the POI Trotskyists from the party. At the time of the establishment of the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale, one small group broke away to form still another element in French Trotskyism, led by a man of Romanian origin named David Cornet, or Corner, who used the name Barta. It began to publish a periodical, Lutte Ouvrière. I don't know if you're supposed to say the L's before you say things with L's and apostrophe in them in French, but who knows. Although consisting of only a handful of people, this group was to continue its separate existence and was the forerunner of one of the 3 major French Trotskyist elements of the 1950s and thereafter, the Lutte Ouvrière group. During and immediately after the phony war period, the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale published 4 issues of its periodical, Étincelles. Jean-Pierre Cassard has noted that the periodical stressed that, quote, it is the working class which will pay for the war. This imperialist war rendered possible by the betrayal of the leaders of the working class, end quote. Among the slogans it raised were, quote, for a just peace, for an immediate peace, it is necessary to fight the capitalist regime, end quote. The first issue of the periodical protested against the suppression of the Communist Party by the French government. It said, quote, the social democratic jackals are biting with all their teeth their Stalinist friends of yesterday, today garroted by the government. We Trotskyists, in spite of the insults and blows of yesterday, protest against the dissolution of the Communist Party of France by the bourgeoisie, against the persecution of their militants. We also have extensive accounts to settle with their chiefs for the betrayal of the labor movement. But we settled these among the workers. Against the bourgeoisie, we show solidarity." End quote. The last issue of the paper came out in September 1940, after which its place was taken by La Vérité. The Molinier Franc faction of French Trotskyism, ex-Parti Communiste Internationaliste, had officially dissolved into the PSOP soon after that party was formed. They continued to function as a group, and as early as February 1939 decided that, in view of the proximity of war, they should set up an underground organization. They rented places which could serve as headquarters and dispersed their records. They also decided that there should be an executive committee which was outside the country. They picked Pierre Franck, Raymond Molinier, Maurice Segal, Braz, Ernesto, and Rodolphe Prager of the youth to form this committee, and these men went to Belgium, where they were at the time the war broke out. Prager had been drafted, but when he was on leave in Paris, he deserted and went to Belgium to join the others. In Belgium, the ex-PCI leaders entered into contact, particularly with the Contre la Couronne group headed by Georges Ferriquin, which had broken with Trotsky some time earlier over the issue of the French turn. They also established contacts in the Netherlands with the followers of Hendrik Sneevliet, who had also broken with Trotsky about a year before the outbreak of the war. Those of the ex-PCI who remained in France regrouped around Henri, Molinier, and Charles Marged, and formed the Comité International pour la Construction de la Fourth Internationale. During the phony war period, much of their effort was concentrated on distributing La Correspondance Internationaliste, printed in Belgium but smuggled extensively across the frontier. Between August 23, 1939 and April 29, 1940, 24 issues of La Correspondance Internationaliste were printed in Belgium and circulated in France. It presented the point of view of the CICQI during that period. Jean-Pierre Cassard has summed up this position, saying that, quote, "feeble and dispersed as organizations, formulating, as they saw it, the need for revolutionary struggle against the war, generally in a dogmatic fashion, due to their youth and inexperience, the Trotskyists resolutely aligned themselves on the side of the world revolution," end quote. La Correspondance Internationaliste expressed the Trotskyist support for revolutionary defeatism. In its first issue, even before the outbreak of the war, it declared that, quote, "defeatism is the class struggle in the war period. It is necessary, therefore, to express the demands of the exploited at the front and in the rear with the object of fraternization," end quote. Once the war began, La Correspondance Internationaliste declared that, quote, "the slogan of the anti-fascist war was only a means of preventing the workers from carrying on the class struggle. The Bolshevik, Leninist, Communist, Internationalist have always declared that there is no distinction to be made in terms of democratic imperialism and imperialism with a fascist structure. We have always accused Stalinism of betraying the interest of the workers, of helping the establishment of fascism in various countries by abandoning the objective of proletarian revolution in favor of that of national defense," end quote. The organ of the CICQI reflected the widespread belief among the Trotskyists that the outbreak of the war presented the opportunity for them to take the leadership in bringing about the world revolution. It proclaimed in its second issue after the war began that, quote, "The imperialist war which has begun does not find us unprepared. It is the hour of the Fourth International. The repression, the Stalinist terror in the class is dead. Finished are the claims about agents of Hitler, Trotskyist spies, pretended clandestine meetings of Leon Trotsky and Rudolf Hess, the right arm of Hitler. Stalin has succeeded in destroying the infamous Moscow trials." End quote. In February 1940, 13 militants of the CICQI, together with 3 members of the XPOI, were arrested and tried for carrying on communist propaganda and undermining the morale of the army and civil population. Among those arrested were Charles Margnet and Pierre Lambert, then a youth activist. They were sentenced to long terms in jail, but most of them succeeded in escaping from prison at the time of the fall of France. Right at the end of the phony war period, the Molinier Front Group sought rapprochement with Trotsky and the Fourth International. An exchange of letters began between Raymond Molinier and Pierre Franck, who were then in Great Britain, and Trotsky and officials of the International Secretariat. The two Frenchmen first wrote Trotsky on May 25, 1940, congratulating him on having escaped the first attempt on his life and expressing an interest in, quote, renewing relations, end quote, with him and the Fourth International. Trotsky responded on July 1st, saying that for such a reconciliation, the Molinierists would have, quote, to be loyal, particularly at present in the tragic times in which we live, end quote, and added that, quote, if you have drawn this conclusion from the past seriously and definitively, then a sincere reconciliation would present no difficulty, end quote. On August 5th, Molinier and Franck replied to Trotsky. They said that, quote, we accept the rights and duties which are defined in your letter of the 1st of July, and this without reserve, without equivocation, end quote. They added that, quote, we shall all use all our force to make our people understand everything, end quote, and agreed that the details of the reconciliation would have to be worked out with the International Secretariat. The letter did not reach Trotsky before his murder. However, subsequently, Molinier and Franck received a letter dated from October 23, 1940, when Jean van Heijenoort, then working at the International Secretariat headquarters in New York, saying, quote, we support the return of Ray with us. Naturally, one cannot demand of anyone that he forget the past. One cannot restore virginity. But if we seriously wish it, I am sure that we can find the way for solid and fertile collaboration, end quote. Finally, Sam Gordon, also writing from the headquarters of the International Secretariat, communicated indirectly with Franck and Molinier, reasserting the International Secretariat's determination to, quote, collaborate to our best, end quote, with them, and promising, quote, to make a more formal reconciliation in about a year of such collaboration, end quote. This exchange of letters was written in terms of correspondence between members of the same family because of, quote, security considerations, end quote. Trotsky is, quote, Uncle Leon, end quote. The two erring Frenchmen are, quote, Pierrette and Raymond, end quote, cousins, end quote. The Fourth International is, quote, the family, end quote, and the International Secretariat is, quote, father, end quote, Professor Say of New York, end quote. The fall of France and the arrest of Molinier and Franck in Great Britain apparently broke off further communication between them and the International. It was to be almost 4 years, not one, before most of the French Trotskyists would be reunited. Jacqueline Plouet Despatin has noted that during the phony war period, the Trotskyists tended largely to be concentrated in and around Paris. Quote, the militants of the two organizations are essentially concentrated in Paris, although there are more or less concentrations in the provinces. In Marseille, Valence, Nice, Toulouse, Mazamet, Clermont-Ferrand, Bordeaux, Lyon, Nantes, Quimper, and Brest. I don't know if I pronounced any of those places right. In spite of the existence of clandestine contacts, these cities, in which the POI tendency usually is dominant, remained largely cut off from the Parisian region. End quote. Overall, the French Trotskyists remained a very small group during this period. It has been estimated, more or less officially, that, quote, parenthesis, very approximately, end parenthesis, there were 30 militants in the ex-PCI, and 100, or perhaps a few more, in the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale, end quote. Confusion and regrouping after the fall of France. The collapse and surrender of the French government and military had during the first few weeks contradictory effects on the French Trotskyists. On the one hand, the military rout of the French armed forces created millions of fleeing refugees, and surrender brought the division of France into the occupied and unoccupied sectors, in addition to total separation of Alsace-Lorraine, Brittany, and the northwest part of France from either of these. These developments undoubtedly cut liaisons which had existed among the members of the Trotskyist movement during the phony war period. On the other hand, the chaos surrounding the defeat and surrender facilitated the escape of Trotskyist political prisoners and the destruction of Trotskyist draftees, the desertion of Trotskyist draftees from the armed forces, and the return of both kinds of people to the civil society where they could enter into contact with their political comrades. Likewise, the total defeat of France had the immediate effect, particularly among French workers, of more or less absolutely discrediting, for the time being at least, all political groups which in any way bore responsibility for getting France into the war and then losing it once the conflict had started. This meant in particular discrediting of the socialist and communist parties and the organized labor movement, particularly the Confédération Générale du Travail, the CGT. The disillusionment of the workers in the old organization seemed to open up possibilities for other political groups, among them, perhaps, the Trotskyists. In the face of the really shattering events of May-June 1940, the two principal Trotskyist groups, that is, the ex-POI and the Molinierists of the ex-PCI, sought almost immediately to regroup and reorganize their forces. By August, they were beginning to make some progress in this direction. During July, the group headed by Marcel Hic, Marcel Beaufrère, and Paul Parisot consisted of members of the POI who had refused to join Marcel Piver's PSOP, made overtures for reunification with the POI, quote, interests, end quote, led by Yvan Craipeau, Marcel Gibelin, and Henri Suzine, who constituted the Comité pour la Fourth Internationale. Over some negotiations, this reunification took place at the beginning of August. A provisional executive consisting of Craipeau, Gibelin, and Suzine of the interest group, and Hic, Beaufrère, and Rigaudias of the non-interest, was established, and they kept the name Comité français pour la Quatrième Internationale. Yvan Craipeau and Marcel sent a report to the International Secretariat of the Fourth International in New York right after the reunification. It was taken out of France by the American Trotskyist Sherry Mangan, the Paris correspondent for Fortune, under the name of Terence Fellon, and a former member of the International Secretariat who had been expelled from France by the occupation authorities. In this report, Craipeau and Hick said that the new group represented, quote, A, the return to the organization of elements which had been practically separated from us in the course of various crises. B, the adherence to the new organization of the people gained by each of the currents during the war. C, the definitive inclusion of a fraction from the PSOP, end quote. They went on to claim that, quote, that signifies practically that in the course of the next several weeks we can organize in clandestinity from 7 to 800 militants, and from that base quickly develop the organization, end quote. They reported that the new group was based on the principles of the Fourth International, and had called themselves, quote, French Committee for the Fourth International, end quote, because they did not consider themselves a full-fledged revolutionary party and felt that the International was still really to be built. However, they asked the International Secretariat to recognize them as its French affiliate and asked for financial aid and for help to get a few people whose lives were particularly in danger out of Europe. For their part, the Molinierists also regrouped. A number of militants who had escaped from prison or the armed forces or had been demobilized joined their comrades who had been active during the phony war period. Some of those leaders who had gone to Belgium a year before also returned to Paris. The technical work of maintaining and bringing back together the ex-PCI people was largely handled by Henri Molinier and Jean-Martin de Pallière, the former companion of Raymond Molinier and then of Leon Sedov, Trotsky's son. In July, a meeting of the 12 ex-PCI leaders took place in the park of St. Cloud. Soon thereafter, they began to publish an information bulletin, largely for circulation among members of the ex-PCI group. The wartime La Vérité. Soon after the reunification of the elements of the old POI, they began to publish an underground newspaper, La Vérité. This was certainly one of the longest-lived and most remarkable of the clandestine periodicals published in France during World War II. The first issue of the wartime La Vérité appeared as a mimeographed sheet on August 31st, 1940. It was identified under the masthead as a, quote, Bolshevik-Leninist organ, end quote. The first issue carried a lead article about the growing conflict between the reactionary and fascist elements operating in Paris and elsewhere in occupied France under German protection, and the Vichy government in unoccupied France. The second page was taken up with an article on the murder of Trotsky. The third page had a piece on the Vichy government's moves to destroy the labor movement and an article entitled Down with Anti-Semitism. On the fourth and final page was an article entitled Our Plan. La Vérité appeared fitfully, sometimes every 2 weeks, at other times once a month. Its first 6 numbers continued to identify it as a, quote, Bolshevik-Leninist organ, end quote. Then after 2 issues, without any identification at all, the 10th number, on March 15, 1941, proclaimed itself a, quote, revolutionary communist organ, end quote, which continued to be its designation until the first printed issue, number 20, dated September 15, 1941, which identified itself as, quote, the central organ of the Comité français pour la Fourth Internationale, end quote. With the transformation of the Comité into the Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste, Fourth Internationale, once again, at the beginning of 1943, the periodical proclaimed itself organ of the Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste. Finally, with the unification of most of the French Trotskyists into the reconstituted Parti Communiste Internationaliste, Section Française de la Fourth Internationale, in March 1944, La Vérité appeared as the, quote, central organ, end quote, of that party until the end of the war. All in all, 77 numbers of the illegal La Vérité appeared. The last few issues still had to be produced clandestinely. Even after the freeing of Paris from German occupation, because the de Gaulle government, which came to power with the liberation of France, for some months refused to permit the legal publication of the periodical. The last illegal number seems to have appeared on December 25, 1944. The paper faithfully reflected the changing positions of the group which published it. La Vérité also reflected the conditions in France at the time, the increasingly bitter economic situation, the growing resistance movements of various kinds, the political machinations of both those elements associated with the occupying power and the Vichy regime, and those aligned with the opposition to them. In addition to La Vérité, which was, or at least aspired to be, a, quote, national, end quote, periodical, there appeared during the war a considerable number of local or regional Trotskyist publications of the various tendencies within the movement. This did not reflect the size or resources of French Trotskyism during this period as much as it did the great difficulties in communication and distribution of literature under German occupation. Most of these periodicals were of an ephemeral nature. Plouet Despatin has gathered an extensive annotated bibliography of these publications. During much of 1941, there was, in addition, a version of La Vérité published in New York by Jean van Heijenoort. Plouet Despatin has noted that, quote, written in French, La Vérité was destined for France, for Francophone Europe, and the colonies. Thanks to the complicity of French sailors, La Vérité reached France, smuggled inside American newspapers. From the Free Zone, where it arrived, it was sent clandestinely to the occupied zone, end quote. Controversy within the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale. Between the fall of France in May-June 1940 and the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, serious controversies raged within both the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale and the Molinier group. They centered on the tactics and strategy which the Trotskyists should use in combating the Nazi triumph and the consequences of this triumph in France and generally in Europe. With the CFQI, the controversy tended to center on whether or not, because of the German conquest, France had been converted into a, quote, oppressed nation, end quote. If that was in fact the case, it was argued that it was necessary for all French classes to join together in the struggle against the Nazi oppressors. The principal exponent of the idea that the CFQI ought to take a, quote, national revolutionary, end quote, position in favor of unity of various classes in the country against the Nazi occupying force was Marcel. He put forth a document, Letter to the English Workers, arguing this line. Jean-Pierre Cassard sums up the content of this piece, which, as a, quote, thesis on the national question, end quote, was adopted unanimously by the Central Committee of the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale. On September 20th, 1940, thus, quote, Nazi occupation is placed on the order of the day, the struggle for national liberation, inseparable from the struggle for the socialist revolution. In this combat, the workers must find an ally in the petite bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie, end quote. The thesis of September 20th was published in the CFQI's bulletin. One passage proclaimed that, quote, France has become an oppressed nation, end quote, and that the immediate issue was therefore, quote, the right of peoples to dispose of themselves, end quote. It declared that in seeking to re-establish that right, the position of the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale was that it, quote, is to the French fraction of the bourgeoisie that we extend our hand, end quote. The position put forth by Marcel and his friends had little room for the traditional revolutionary defeatism which Trotskyists had favored. Rather, it involved support for the British in the continuing struggle against Nazi Germany. A publication of the CFQI in February 1941 proclaimed that, quote, the problem is to use and support in our own way the military struggle of English imperialism, the only means of the present stage of weakening the German military apparatus, the principal obstacle. For the English workers, this signifies abandonment of revolutionary defeatism, end quote. That line was not as strongly reflected in La Vérité as one might have expected, although the paper frequently pointed out and criticized the subservience of the Vichy government to the German occupation forces, and stressed the need for revitalizing the French economy so as to put the large part of the working class which is unemployed back to work. The articles in La Vérité almost always called upon the workers to take the lead on their own in opening up the closed factories and putting them to work, seeking out available raw materials and taking other steps to put them back into operation. The newspaper frequently returned to the theme of the need for socialist revolution and the establishment of the United Socialist States of Europe as the only answer to the Nazi conquest of the continent. On only 2 occasions between August 1940 and June 1941 have we found more or less frank appeals to French nationalism in La Vérité. One second. Gotta blow my nose. In the issue of October 1st, 1940, the lead article is entitled, Only the French People Can Reconstruct France. It proclaimed that, quote, the German army doesn't want to reorganize France. German imperialism doesn't want French industry to commence to function. Its interest, ... is to prevent the functioning of the least French institution, ... It is upon the initiative of the people of France that the recovery of the country depends, ... end quote. The second article, making a, quote, national revolutionary, end quote, appeal was one on the second page of the issue of January 1st, 1941, dealing with the new, quote, labor charter, end quote, the Vichy government was proposing to issue. It argued that, quote, all those who fight against the oppressor and who are not workers must understand that the support of the working class forces is vitally necessary for the success of the struggle for national liberation, end quote. There were within the CFQI elements who both wanted a stronger appeal to French nationalism than that proposed by Heek, and those who opposed such an appeal altogether. The former group, in fact, left the organization and established their own group in conjunction with non-Trotskyist elements. The latter continued to be an opposition element within the CFQI so long as the Comité Français continued to exist. Jean Rousse left the CFQI to join with some ex-members of the PSOP and other groups to form the Mouvement National Révolutionnaire, MNR. It published 3 issues of an illegal periodical, La Révolution Française, in July, August, and September 1940, and 4 numbers of another periodical, Le Combat National Révolutionnaire, between March and June 1941. Quote, Pluet Despotin, forget the quote part. Pluet Despotin has synthesized the position of the MNR. Quote, the MNR is for a, quote, true, end quote, socialism, quote, inserted in the French tradition and genius, end quote, in which production would center on a large nationalized and planned sector, which would be in the hands of, quote, directing committees, end quote. Those will be, quote, directly derived from the world of work, organized in its professional categories, that is, the workers, the employers who work, particularly the small and middle employers, the technicians, the artisans, the peasants, end quote. The MNR supports a strong hierarchical state in which the relations between various elements of the population will be established by, quote, corporations, end quote. Hostile to the pseudo-democratic parliamentary regime, to totalitarianism, and to racism, the MNR is favorable to the imperial unity of France and its national independence, end quote. Pluet Despatin notes that the MNR regarded the, quote, collaboration, end quote, of the Vichy regime with the Nazis as, quote, a colonization of France by Germany, end quote. It advocated, quote, strong resistance to Germany when it becomes oppressive, end quote. And that, quote, it is necessary to profit from all blows struck by England against Germany, because, quote, in the conflicting contradictions of the new situation, there can begin to develop a policy of French liberation, end quote, end quote. The MNR was dissolved by the German authorities in June 1941. A third group of CFQI militants opposed entirely the nationalist orientation which the Comité had during the first years after the fall of France. Headed by Marcel Gibelin, who resigned from the Central Committee of the CFQI, they formed the Internationalist opposition within the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale. This group, set up in October-November 1940, opposed, quote, what it considered to be the nationalist orientation, end quote, of the CFQI. The internationalist opposition continued in existence until the unification of most French Trotskyists in March 1944. The Molinierists also were very critical of the alleged, quote, nationalism, end quote, of the CFQI. As late as the Congress of their group in January 1944, they adopted a long document criticizing that position. However, Ernest Mandel, the Belgian Trotskyist leader, in an appendix to a book by Pierre, who at the time was associated with the Molinier group, and in any case spent most of World War II in Great Britain, has concluded that whatever nationalist ideological vagaries of the CFQI engaged in 1940 to 41, they had little practical or lasting effect. Ernest Mandel has written that, quote, in fact, it did not lead to anything in practice. Those who say that the French Trotskyists, quote, betrayed, end quote, by making a bloc with the bourgeoisie in 1940 to 41, do not understand the difference between the beginning of a theoretical mistake and an actual treacherous intervention in the class struggle. There was never any agreement with the bourgeoisie, never any support for them when it came to the point, ... I think the comrades of the POI minority who fought against it did a good job, and by 1942, it was reversed and did not come up again. End quote. Ernest Mandel. The revisionism of Henri Molinier. The controversies within the Molinierist faction were of quite a different nature. They centered on different assessments of the degree of total victory which the Nazis had achieved in 1940, the probable duration of Nazi domination of France and the rest of Europe, and consequently, the methods of struggle the Trotskyists should adopt vis-a-vis the victorious Nazis in the French regime and political movements which appeared in the wake of the Nazi victory. Henri Molinier, who was also known as, quote, Testu, end quote, was the principal advocate of a profound revision of traditional Trotskyist ideas and consequently of strategy and tactics in the face of the Nazi victory and its consequences. He put forth his ideas in a publication, Que faire, What to Do, which appeared on August 28, 1940. Henri Molinier began by arguing that the USSR had become a form of state capitalism. Quote, which assimilated it with Nazi Germany, also characterized as state capitalist, end quote, according to Jean-Pierre Cassard. Molinier foresaw, furthermore, quote, the relative stabilization for a fairly long time of fascist state capitalism, end quote. Cassard has noted that, quote, the analysis of Tetsu goes very far. He thinks that a new period has begun. The fascist and Stalinist mass organizations are going to dominate the working class in the country. Within these movements exist anti-capitalist currents. It is necessary for the revolutionary militants to make them evolve towards the international, the proletarian revolution. Kiefer proposes, therefore, entrism within the fascist organizations, the PCF, and its popular committees. This orientation has, as a logical consequence, the disappearance of all independent expression of the Trotskyists, end quote. Controversy raged for years over what had been the practical consequences of the line advocated by Tetsu. Jacqueline Pluet Despatrines has extensively investigated this controversy. She has found unconvincing the charges from Stalinist and ex-Trotskyist sources that members of the Molinier faction collaborated with the occupation authorities, held leadership positions in the fascist organization established by the ex-socialist Marcel in 1941, or volunteered to join the French Volunteer Corps organized by Jacques Doriot and sent to fight with the German army on the Russian home front. However, she does note that the European Secretariat of the Fourth International in March 1944 questioned the activities of Henri Molinier and Roger Fourier within the Barta Group, the Rassemblement National Populaire. She has noted, too, that the reunified Trotskyist Party in its first Congress in November 1944 set up a commission of inquiry on the subject, and that even after the war, the Parti Communiste Internationaliste felt called upon to issue officially a, quote, explanation, end quote, of the affair. Two associates of the Moliniers have borne witness to the fact that neither Henri Molinier nor Roger Fourier broke discipline of the Trotskyists or in any real way cooperated with the Nazis or with French, quote, collaborators, end quote. These witnesses are Rodolphe Prager, who was a leading figure in the PCI underground, and Pierre Franck, Raymond Molinier's principal lieutenant in the 1930s and a major French Trotskyist leader in the post-war period. Rodolphe Prager has noted that, quote, the only two solutions for old militants known to the police were to go into illegality or obtain political cover, ... Knowing that the clandestine life under the Gestapo was going to be very rude and difficult if it prolonged for several years, the organization decided to authorize the use of such stratagems in a very exceptional situation. It was not a matter of compromising with Nazism, it was a ruse of war, which permitted these two comrades to, quote, cover, end quote, their intensive clandestine activity at the head of a Trotskyist organization. H. Molinier, in particular, concentrated on seeking the financial resources vital for a clandestine organization. The information gained in the collaboration centers was furthermore useful and transmitted to the resistance. That has nothing in common with, quote, entrism, end quote, or a French term involving no objective of carrying out political activities in that milieu, seeking only to provoke error by the class enemy, end quote. Prager commented specifically on Roger Fourier. He noted that, quote, the personality of Fourier was so little questioned that he was elected to the International Control Commission by the Second World Congress of the Fourth International in 1948. Finally, Prager Prager also dealt with the charge that some PCI people sought to recruit volunteers to join French elements fighting with the Nazis on the Russian front. He wrote that, quote, "This concerns a former member of the PCI, René Binet, leader of the Barta Group, who had broken in December 1938 because of the entrism into the PSOP, who, as a prisoner of war in Germany, turned from virulent anti-Stalinism to admiration of Nazism. As we know that he, as soon as we knew that he had become a fascist, we denounced him in our bulletin. I am not sure if he went to the Russian front, but he sought to recruit others. He led fascist groups in France after the war and died rapidly," end quote. Pierre Franck also bore witness to the continued loyalty of Molinier and Fourier to the Trotskyist movement. He noted that, quote, "Independently of the particular analysis that each might make from one moment to another, both Henri Molinier and Roger Fourier, who more than once took risks in their existence, were always Trotskyist militants working loyally according to the decision of their organization and under its control," end quote. In any case, there was a substantial element within the Molinier group which did not agree with the position of Testu. This opposition was particularly strong in the Marseille region, but in the Paris area, one of its principal spokesmen was Pierre Lambert. He wrote in the internal bulletin of the Molinier group in November 1940 that, quote, "The comrades say quite rightly that fascism is a capitalist expression, ... For one thing, the violence of the struggle, which will be greatly accentuated in the coming months, will bring enormous destruction of productive forces, which means, if I am not mistaken, economic regression, ... With Germany victorious, Dr. Franck has already said to us that Europe will be converted into a source of supplies of raw materials, which is to say that we have the prospect for France of the destruction of national industries. Where are the progressive characteristics of that?" End quote. End quote. Lambert ended his article saying, quote, "The victory of fascism will only occur on the ruins of civilization. Lenin and the old man," which is what people call Trotsky, "recently have said that unless there is the proletarian revolution, there will be the return to barbarism. In this epoch in which the economic conditions are more than mature for the realization of socialism," end quote. French Trotskyism and the Nazi war on the Soviet Union. The Nazi attack on the Soviet Union on June 21, 1941, put an end to the ideological confusion within the ranks of the French Trotskyists. They returned to the orthodox view of the nature of the Soviet Union and the need to defend it against all attack, and they saw the struggle of the USSR against the German invaders as part of the general struggle for socialist revolution in Europe and throughout the world. This return to Trotskyist orthodoxy took place both in the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale and in the Molinier group. The first issue of La Vérité after the attack on the USSR, dated June 25, 1941, was devoted exclusively to a statement of the CFQI on that event. After analyzing the causes of the attack, the statement said that, quote, "In all countries starting now, the workers must organize to paralyze the Hitlerian aggression, ... end quote." The next issue of the CFQI periodical, dated August 1st, consisted largely of an article entitled, "It is Necessary to Defend the USSR." It started by asking, quote, why, end quote. And among various answers to this, it said, quote, because Hitler wants to profit from the perilous situation created for the USSR by the betrayals of the Stalinist bureaucracy to annihilate the workers' state, the planned economy, the collective property, to make the USSR a source of raw materials, to end labor, a market for the products of capitalist industry. Because Hitler can thus instill a new bit of life in dying capitalism, terminate the war, and submerge in blood for many years all possibility of class struggle. End quote. For the French Trotskyists, the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union did not change the nature of the war between Germany and Great Britain. Together with the United States, which they saw was soon to enter the conflict. La Vérité wrote on December 5, 1941, quote, we have already said what we think of the war of Churchill. That war remains an imperialist war. That is to say, anti-working class, even if Churchill defends the USSR, end quote. Early in the conflict, the editors of La Vérité indicated that what they thought ought to be the attitude of all workers towards the war against the Soviet Union. In the issue of October 15, 1941, they wrote that, quote, it is necessary in the democratic countries to get started a proletarian program of aid to the USSR, to demand, by demonstrations and if necessary strikes, the immediate dispatch of all available war materials. The railroaders, dockers, sailors must assure immediate transport. The workers in armament factories must demand full production, without profit, for the USSR, on all levels, with all groups. This struggle can only make full sense as part of the simultaneous struggle for control of workers' committees and the taking of power, end quote. On the other hand, quote, in the countries under the fascist boot, everything must be done to undermine the offensive capacity of the Axis armies. But it is important to understand that this task cannot be carried out by methods of terror and individual sabotage. What is needed is to organize the movement of large masses, that is, to prepare the revolution, Furthermore, today, to save the USSR, it is necessary to put first the program of the world proletarian revolution, and to rally the working class in a unanimous bloc for the defense of the workers' state. It is necessary to return, in the USSR itself, to the revolutionary and Leninist methods. It is necessary to run out the organizers of defeat. It is necessary above all at the front, in the rear, to rely on the initiative of the workers and peasant masses, end quote. The French Trotskyists felt themselves part of the struggle going on in the Soviet Union. In a curious article in December 4th, 1941, in a curious article in the December 4th, 1941 issue of La Vérité, they claim that, quote, the voice of the oppositionists and the Trotskyists has made itself heard in Moscow, Leningrad, Irkutsk. It calls all the Soviet peoples and the proletarians of all countries to the defense of the workers' state, for the defense of the conquest of October 1917. In another passage, this article said that, quote, it is because the Trotskyists die in Leningrad, Moscow, Rostov, Brussels, Paris, and Nantes before the fascist enemy that we have the right to speak to the communist militants, end quote. In this same article, La Vérité even claimed that Jean van Heijenoort, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I think it's Heijenoort. I'm not sure. The French Trotskyist, who was then serving as the Secretariat of the Fourth International in New York, had volunteered and been accepted for service in the Red Army. Van Heijenoort has written about this report that, quote, the information in La Vérité is of course incorrect. Sometime in 1941, the Russian press, Pravda, Pravda, published a short item bracket, a few lines, end bracket, stating that I had enlisted in the Red Army. I've never seen the item myself, but it was reported to me by various persons. This was perhaps a trick contrived by Stalin-Beria in order to rally some Trotskyists to the regime, end quote. The Molinier faction also rallied to the defense of the Soviet Union. A statement issued on June 28th and again on August 1st, 1941, said of the USSR that, quote, the liquidation of the political conquest doesn't change the fact that this economy, the way it is, represents for the working class and the entire world an inestimable value for the future struggles against capital and for the realization of socialism. In this context, we are defenders of this economy, end quote. For the French Trotskyists, the defense of the Soviet Union was inextricably intertwined with the struggle for world revolution. The triumph of that revolution was inevitable, and that triumph would involve the overthrow of the Stalin regime. A typical statement of this point of view appeared in La Vérité on July 25, 1942, in an article entitled, quote, For the Revolutionary Defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. The writer said that, quote, the proletarian revolution is on the march. In spite of all the obstacles that Stalin may accumulate in its way, it will triumph. The class struggle of workers of all countries, democratic or fascist, more than all the treaties, will assure a true defense of the Soviet Union. A victory of the revolution in Europe will definitely guarantee the USSR against all aggression. And as Stalin makes agreements once again with the enemy, with imperialism, he must know that the revolution will get rid of him, and it will get rid of his friends of the White Guard and the Churchills at the same time as the Hitlers, Lavals, and Mussolinis, end quote. Trotskyist fraternization efforts. The French Trotskyists believed firmly in carrying the message of the Fourth International to the Germans, both the workers back home and the German soldiers in France. A typical statement of their position appeared in La Vérité on July 10, 1942, under the headline, quote, Hand extended to the German workers, end quote. This article said that the readers would see, quote, in particular, how criminal is the present policy of Stalinism, which claims that the German people are responsible for the present situation. They will see that our watchword, quote, fraternization with the German workers in green uniform or the, quote, blue, end quote, one of work, end quote, is not a, quote, utopian, end quote, idea, and that it is, on the contrary, the only realistic watchword, the watchword which, tomorrow, will be carried out in practice for the socialist liberation of Europe, end quote. The CFQI put their belief in fraternization into practice, specifically in Brest, in Brittany. The principal person in charge of this work was the German Martin Monat, or Martin Monat. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. German. I don't know if his name's pronounced German. I don't fucking know. Who was then more generally known as, quote, Victor, end quote, and was a member of the European Secretariat of the Fourth International. He worked very closely with two German Trotskyists, Paul and Clara Thalmann. And the center of the work was a 7-room house of the Thalmanns, quote, which became a veritable Tower of Babel, end quote. I believe one of the leading people of the German Communist Party has a name looks like Thalmann. I can't remember what the fuck his first name is. Might be Ernst. I don't know. But his has a, what's it called? And I don't know what the fucking thing's called, but the 2 dots over his name, his name is pronounced Tellman. So these aren't the same people. Anyway. The principal work of fraternization was carried out through a newspaper, Arbeiter und Soldat, edited by Monat and the Tellmans. It was a mimeographed sheet which appeared in July, August, and September 1943. The first issue carried the subtitle Organ for Revolutionary Proletarian Rally. But the second and third numbers added Fourth International as further identification. The first issue of Arbeiter und Soldat consisted essentially of a long essay dealing with German history since World War I, the evolution and dissolution of the Comintern, the Spanish Civil War, and recent developments in Germany. The tone of the issue is perhaps best expressed in this statement, quote, "It is with this process of destruction of fascist domination and all bourgeois domination, in this work of sapping the capitalist war front, of reconstitution of the proletarian class front, of preparation of the communist revolution that Arbeiter und Soldat aligns itself. Its tasks are therefore perfectly indicated." End quote. The third issue of the paper began with a headline, "We want defeat." The lead article said, quote, "We wish the defeat of our capitalist class in this war. They are going to cry out. These gentlemen of industry, bank barons, all the Nazi bosses and the generals, all those who are still blinded and misled by them, and they will call us, quote, traitors to the fatherland, end quote, and, quote, agents of the enemy, end quote. But we hold fast. We want the defeat of our capitalists. We prefer that to their victory, end quote. In addition to Arbeiter und Soldat, maybe it's Soldat, I think it's actually said, Arbeiter und Soldat, the German soldiers working with the French Trotskyists put out several issues of a periodical of their own, Zeitung für Soldat und Arbeiter in Westen. Copies of only one issue seem to have survived. It, too, was mimeographed and was more, quote, popular, end quote, than Arbeiter und Soldat, having cartoons and short news items and appeals for support for the Fourth International. There were about 15 German soldiers who worked with the French Trotskyists in the Brest area. They were engaged principally in surreptitiously distributing the periodicals. However, the Gestapo was soon able to break up the fraternization effort. On October 6, 1943, the Gestapo moved extensively against both the French Trotskyists and their German friends in Brest, as well as conducting raids in Paris against the Parti Ouvrière Internationaliste, which the CFQI had by then become. Although Martin Monat was able to escape that roundup, 11 other Breton Trotskyists were caught and 4 of them were killed. It was reported that 15 German soldiers were executed at the same time, although this news was never officially published. In Paris, a group of French Trotskyist leaders was also rounded up, including Marcel and David Rousset, and they were sent to concentration camps. Heek did not survive his concentration camp experience. One German soldier was also executed in Paris after being tortured because of his contacts with the Trotskyists. This did not entirely end the work of collaboration of French Trotskyists with German soldiers. A new version of Arbeiter und Soldat, this time printed instead of mimeographed, began to appear in April 1944. It proclaimed itself the organ of the German section of the Fourth International. Like its predecessor, this journal was edited by Martin Monat. Monat was arrested by the Gestapo about a month before the capture of Paris by Allied troops and was never seen by his friends again. Monat's arrest ended the second Arbeiter und Soldat. Organizational evolution of French Trotskyists. From its establishment in October 1940, the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale had assigned particular tasks to its major leaders. Marcel and Yvan Craipeau were the editorial committee of La Vérité, a trade union commission was directed by Henri Suzin. David Rousset was charged principally with intelligence work, facilitated by the fact that he was employed in the Vichy Ministry of Information. Other leaders had other specific tasks. For the first 2 years, one of the most important activities of the CFQI was to maintain contacts with the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States and the Fourth International headquarters in New York. This was achieved through the Marseille organization of the CFQI, led by Albert de Mazières, members of which were in contact with the Socialist Workers' Party members working in the United States Merchant Marine who visited the French port periodically. Some of the Marseille Trotskyists were also associated with a local office of the International Rescue Committee of the USA, which was principally engaged in providing relief for left-wing political leaders in unoccupied France and facilitating their getting visas for entry into the United States. In June 1942, the Vichy police closed down the International Rescue Committee operation and at the same time rounded up most of the leaders of the Marseille Trotskyist group, including de Mazières. For many years thereafter, there were widespread questions about the possible role in those police actions of Michel Kokosinski, a CFQI member and employee of the International Rescue Committee who turned up at the end of the war as a member of the Communist Party. The question of whether or not Kokosinski had betrayed his associates was not even adequately resolved by a, quote, tribunal of honor, end quote, which studied the question as late as 1965. In April 1942, Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale changed its name to Comité Français de la Fourth Internationale, a change which was reflected on the masthead of La Vérité in its issue of April 10, 1942 and thereafter. Jean-Pierre Cassard has noted concerning this change that even before their contacts with the international headquarters were severed, they, quote, ceased to consider that they were working for the Fourth International. Rather, they affirmed that through their activity, the Fourth International was very much alive in the heart of the Second World conflict. They were the French committees of the Fourth International, end quote. On December 26 to 27, 1942, the Central Committee of the group held a plenary session, quote, in a city of France, end quote, in which there took part, quote, representatives of all the essential sectors of the organization, end quote. This meeting, which was reported in the January 15, 1943 issue of La Vérité, made several important decisions. One was to issue a call for the formation of a, quote, workers' front, end quote, composed of, quote, the most class-conscious of the workers, syndicalist militants, Trotskyist militants, communist militants, anarchists, former secretaries of enterprise trade union sections, former workshop delegates, combatants of June 36, combatants of November 38, youths trained in the hard school of illegality, end quote. The meeting authorized the Central Committee to issue a letter of invitation, quote, to workers' organizations for the creation of a workers' front, end quote. It agreed that organizations should be formed, quote, in factory enterprise neighborhoods, end quote, while simultaneous efforts would be made to launch such a front on a national basis. Another major decision of the December 1942 meeting was to change the name back to Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste, Fourth International, saying that this did not mean that, quote, the Party of the Revolution is definitively constituted, end quote. On the contrary, the meeting instructed the Central Committee, quote, to redouble its efforts, in reinforcing the links among the workers' vanguard, to permit the whole proletariat to engage victoriously in the struggle for the socialist United States of Europe and of the world, end quote. In pursuance of this proposal, a special mimeographed issue of La Vérité was published on the 25th of April, 1943, consisting only of an open letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party urging establishment of a workers' front. It expressed willingness to have the, quote, popular committees, end quote, being established by the Communists as a basis for this front. The letter ended, quote, long live the Workers' Front, long live the Communist Revolution, Bolshevik greetings, end quote. In June 1943, the POI held what is called its Fifth Congress. La Vérité devoted its July 9th issue entirely to this meeting. It reported that the Congress was attended by, quote, an important number of delegates from all regions of the country, end quote. La Vérité reported 2 documents adopted by the POI's Fifth Congress. One was a manifesto, quote, to the workers of France, end quote. The second one dealt with the Workers' Front. The manifesto declared that, quote, the hour of the revolution has sounded, end quote, and warned against, quote, the reactionary plan of Wall Street and the city, end quote. The city being, I'm assuming, the city of London. The financial district of London. It concluded by asserting that, quote, more than ever, the emancipation of the workers can only be the work of the workers themselves, ... It must carry on the combat on its own ground, that of class action, with its own methods, those of the class struggle, ... End quote. While the POI was being reestablished, the Molinierists were likewise working to revive their pre-war organization. At the same time, both groups were inching toward the general reunification of French Trotskyism. With the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, steps were taken to heal the split which had developed within the Molinier ranks as a result of the policy advocated by Henri Molinier. The opponents of the line of Testu were particularly concentrated in unoccupied France centered on Marseille. There, they had continued to use the name Parti Communiste Internationaliste. After June 21, 1941, they were joined in their opposition by most of the leadership of the group in the Paris area. One consequence was the retirement of Henri Molinier from the leadership. In January 1942, the Molinier group was reorganized. A provisional political bureau was chosen, and it was decided to issue a monthly theoretical journal, La Seule Voix, LASEULEVOIE. It was also agreed to establish, quote, cells, end quote, of not more than 5 members each to carry on the rank-and-file organizational work. These were to exercise discipline over their members, dropping those from membership who in fact were not active. Each cell was to issue its own agitational periodicals for distribution among workers. La Seule Voix group held what they called a pre-conference in February 1943. They decided to adopt the name Comité Communiste Internationaliste, to issue a new monthly periodical, Les Soviets, and to number its first issue, 157, to indicate its continuity with the pre-war PCI publication, La Commune. At the same time, La Seule Voix would continue to be published as the CCI's, the Comité Communiste Internationaliste, theoretical organ. Steps were taken to reestablish contact with ex-PCI elements in the unoccupied zone with whom contacts had been broken. End quote. Sorry, there's no quote there. That's just a fleck on the print. Well, not a fleck, but a number for an endnote. The pre-conference of the CCI also adopted a resolution calling for the establishment of workers' groups, Lutte Ouvrière. Jean-Pierre Cassard has explained the concept behind the GO. The GO. The, quote, the Groupe Ouvrière is a rudimentary but progressive form of organization of the class for combat, The Groupe Ouvrière regroups the most consequent elements in the factory to carry on clandestine combat in the enterprise, to organize resistance to deportation, to employer and governmental maneuvers, to express and defend workers' demands, to present problems on the basis of class and channel the best people into communist activity, end quote. Cassar noted that the leaders of the CCI were never able to decide whether the Groupe Ouvrière were embryonic Soviets or underground trade unions. He noted that usually where they were really established, they tended toward the latter alternative and ultimately were absorbed by the unions of the CGT. Finally, the pre-conference of the CCI adopted a political resolution entitled, quote, Americanism against Bolshevism, end quote, which Cassar attributed to, quote, the youth and political inexperience of the group, end quote. He summed up the essence of this resolution, quote, the USA liquidating the USSR liquidates Stalinism, the USA liquidating Germany opens the world revolution. The world revolution open, it is the hour of the Fourth International, end quote. Cassar cited a passage from the resolution, quote, the attack of the USA on the USSR will open the Civil War. It is the crumbling of German imperialism which will set off the world revolution. The committees and the Soviets will appear from the first days of combat. It will be the victory in Germany or its crumbling everywhere. Power to the Soviets in Berlin or barbarism in the world. ... The proletariat will seek new cadres, a new organization, a new program. It will be the hour of the Fourth International, end quote. This resolution provoked a schism within the CCI. A minority led by Henri Molinier, the Spaniard Fanfaron, and Pierre Lambert saw it as extremely sectarian and leading to mistaken positions on concrete issues. One of these was the uprising of Italian workers in March 1943, creating revolutionary conditions which were only suppressed by Nazi troops. The majority of the CCI executive claimed that this uprising was, quote, within the struggle of American imperialism against the USSR, end quote. The minority, on the other hand, proclaimed it to be, quote, a first eruption of the masses, end quote, which the Trotskyists should support. In January 1944, the CCI held its first and only Congress. The leadership presented a recapitulation of the group's activities since April 1943. 3 issues of Les Soviets published, 40 throwaways, 4 issues of La Seule Voix. The Congress also expelled the principal figures in the minority, Henri Molinier, Fanfaron, and Lambert, who promptly joined the POI. The meeting also established the CCI's conditions for Trotskyist unity, which included continuation of La Seule Voix as a factional organ within the unified party and equality with the POI in its leadership. Reunification of French Trotskyism. The European Secretariat of the Fourth International, which had been functioning since 1942, used its good offices to bring about the unification of the various groups in France professing loyalty to Trotskyism. There were 4 of these: the Parti Ouvrière Internationaliste, with its majority, and the International Opposition minority. The CCI, also with a majority and minority faction, the October Group, and the Lutte des Classes Group. The October Group was a new faction. It owed its inspiration to Henri Molinier, who had been principally responsible for organizing it among a group of non-Trotskyists to whom he had lectured extensively on Marxism and Trotskyism, and had won over to the ideas of the Fourth International. Jean-Pierre Cassard concluded that Molinier organized this group outside of existing Trotskyist factions as a bargaining pawn in the unity negotiations. In December 1943, it was invited to meet with the POI, CCI, and European Secretariat in negotiations for French Trotskyist unity, and it accepted the invitation and became a part of the European Secretariat. The Lutte des Classes group was quite different. It had been established in 1939 by Barta and held itself to be the only true Trotskyist element in France. It was the only one which stayed out of the unity achieved in February 1944. The first overtures toward reunification took place during the first half of 1942. In April, La Voix group wrote a letter to the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale, suggesting establishment of a liaison committee between the two organizations. The Comité responded favorably. Subsequently, each organization had fraternal delegates at the other's national congress. The European Congress, organized by the European Secretariat in February 1944, brought to conclusion the process of French unification. It set a time limit of 1 month for its achievement and decreed that there should be a central committee of 3 from the POI, 2 from the CCI, 1 from the October Group plus Michel Raptis, Pablo, of the European Secretariat. The new group took the name Parti Communiste Internationaliste, which the European Congress decided that all European sections should adopt. The March 25, 1944 issue of La Vérité, the first to carry the identification Organe Central du Parti Communiste Internationaliste, carried the, quote, Declaration of Unity, end quote, of the 3 groups establishing the new party and a lead editorial. It is necessary to build the Revolutionary Party. This editorial ended, quote, the moment has come to forge in action the Revolutionary Party, to make it a powerful instrument of the working class. It is the understanding of the 3 organizations which unite today in the Parti Communiste Internationaliste. At the decisive turning point of the Second World War, the Fourth International is at its post of combat, keeping high and firm the flag of the revolution, end quote. The new PCI held its first Congress in December 1944. Since the de Gaulle government had not legalized the party, the meeting had to be held in semi-legal circumstances. It was reported in La Vérité of December 25th that, quote, a sufficient number of delegates had been arranged to permit all tendencies to express themselves completely, end quote. La Vérité also said that the new Central Committee, elected at the Congress, quote, represents all the tendencies which have expressed themselves, end quote. The Congress adopted a, quote, plan of action, end quote. It included, quote, a plan of reconstruction elaborated by the CGT, applied under control of the workers' committees, nationalization without indemnity or purchase of the banks and trusts, government of the PS, PC, CGT, armament of the people, workers' militia, international unity of action of the proletarians, end quote. 1 second. The Lutte des Classes group. We have noted the breakaway of the group led by David Corner, Barta, from the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale right at the beginning of World War II. According to Jean-Pierre Cassard, the dissidence of the Barta Group had begun as a consequence of the formal establishment of the Fourth International in September 1938, which it had opposed. The Barta Group itself explained its break with the Comité by the charge that the Comité Français pour la Fourth Internationale, quote, is limited to a petty bourgeois milieu where organizational practices are social democratic, not communist, end quote. Once established, it directed its recruiting efforts principally towards disillusioned members of the Communist Party, disoriented by the Stalin-Nazi pact and the resoluting 180-degree turn in the policies of the French Communist Party. The Barta Group began publishing a periodical, Lutte Ouvrière, 3 issues of which appeared. It proclaimed itself a Marxist-Leninist organ. After the last number of L'Ouvrier, early in 1940, the group gave no evidence of its existence until November of that year. The Barta faction strongly opposed the nationalist turn of the Comité Français after the fall of France. That position, it proclaimed, quote, constitutes a betrayal of the class struggle and a weakening of the struggle against national oppression, end quote. On October 15, 1942, the Barta Group began to publish a new periodical, La Lutte des Classes, and from then on it was generally known by the name of its periodical. It was at first included in preparations for unifying French Trotskyism. A letter addressed to them by the POI and the CCI on December 10, 1943, recognized that the Barta Group, quote, is entirely on the terrain of Trotskyism, end quote, and invited the group to, quote, clarify its political positions and end its isolation from the organizations of the Fourth International in France, end quote. The La Lutte des Classes group replied to this invitation on December 16th. According to Jean-Pierre Cassard, quote, the group claimed to have broken all contacts with the past of the Fourth International in France to be able to construct the revolutionary section of the Fourth International, ... end quote. A further letter from the Barta Group to the Unity Committee of the French Trotskyists attacked the POI and the CCI as, quote, petty bourgeois organizations incapable of constructing the revolutionary party, end quote, and refused to have anything more to do with the unification efforts. La Lutte des Classes thus continued its separate existence. It recruited a number of young people and continued to publish its paper. They began particularly to carry on agitation among factory workers, and for a short while after the war had considerable influence among the auto workers of the Paris region, leading a strike at the Renault company. Unlike the case of the PCI and La Vérité, the Lutte des Classes group did not seek legalization of its paper by the de Gaulle government. In 1944, it argued that such legal recognition would constitute, quote, compromising those who wish really to struggle against imperialist war with the authorization and under the control of bourgeois censorship, end quote. The French resistance. Organized opposition to German occupation forces was slow in developing in France. In fact, elements which were later to be among key factors in the resistance at first sought to collaborate with the Germans. The Communist Party, for instance, sent Maurice Traillant to Gestapo headquarters seeking legalization of the party newspaper La Humanité. When he was then arrested by French police, he was freed on orders of the German authorities. In the beginning, opposition to the Germans found expression mainly in violent attacks on individual German soldiers and more or less spontaneous demonstrations. Thus, a German sentry was killed in Weinekert a few days after the French surrender. And on November 11th, 1940, a group of a few hundred students marched down the Champs-Élysées singing the Marseillaise, and chanting slogans against Hitler to commemorate the Armistice Day of World War I. It was not until the Germans began to round up hundreds of thousands of French workers to work in German industry and on farms that massive resistance began. Werner Rings has noted that, quote, the war had already been decided, and the Battle of Stalingrad was over, end quote, before a major organized underground struggle against the Germans began. Quote, in May 1943, Commander-in-Chief West reported for the first time that, quote, armed guerrilla bands, end quote, 500 strong had formed in the department of Corrèze. These consisted of deserters from the labor service, parties of men who had evaded conscription by taking to the woods without military organization and equipment. It was not until the summer of 1943 that German situation reports from France spoke of resistance groups run on quasi-military lines, quote, some wearing a variety of uniforms, others identified by armbands, end quote. Ultimately, three groups emerged in the resistance. Quote, the United Resistance Movements, end quote, MUR, the purely military, quote, Army Resistance Organization, end quote, ONA, the communist, quote, French Irregulars and Partisans, end quote, the PTP, all of which officially emerged early in February 1944, having been formed, the, quote, French Forces of the Interior, end quote, FFI, were then restructured like a proper army with national, regional, and department command centers in 12 military districts subordinate to a general staff, end quote. The Stalinists had a major role in the resistance. Werner Rings has noted that, quote, the communists secured a majority on the departmental liberation committees and also gained control of the military committee of the, quote, National Resistance Council, end quote, CNR, formed in the spring of 1943, end quote. This role of the Stalinists was due, quote, not only to efficiency, discipline, and fanatical self-sacrifice, but also to the Soviet Union's reputation among communists and non-communists alike as the premier resistance power, end quote. Trotskyists in the resistance. Because of their small numbers, weak organization, and internal divisions, the Trotskyists could not play more than an exceedingly modest role in the resistance. They were further hindered in trying to capitalize on the fight against the Nazi invaders and the Nazis' French collaborators by their ideological position, which misinterpreted the nature of the struggle. They insisted on seeing it primarily as a class struggle and the first act in the proletarian revolution in France, Europe, and the world as a whole rather than a national struggle against the German conquerors. Before unification of the POI and the CCI, the former had carried on propaganda for the, quote, Workers' Front, end quote, and the latter for the, quote, Workers' Groups, end quote. These both seem to be conceived of as having the combined role of presenting the workers' immediate demands in their plants and factories and serving as a nuclei for revolutionary Soviets, which would obtain arms and seize power with the collapse of the German occupation. After unification, the Parti Communiste Internationaliste used both, quote, Workers' Front and, quote, Workers' Groups interchangeably or even together, but the concept of them had not changed. The Trotskyists continually presented their prescription for socialist revolution in La Vérité and their other publications. Typical is what appeared in La Vérité on April 29, 1944, about 6 weeks before the Allied landings in Normandy. This editorial argued that, quote, the preparation of the workers for armed struggle is the order of the day. Each conscientious worker must seek to procure arms munitions. But most essential is the direction, the organization of the struggle. For that, it is necessary at present to form in the factories quarries, mines, clandestine workers' groups of 3 to 4 sure comrades which will prepare the struggle for demands in the enterprise and undertake at the same time the preparation of the armed struggle. Courage, heroism are not sufficient for this struggle. It must be understood that the proletariat never struggles on equal terms with the forces of the bourgeoisie. The power of the proletariat resides above all in its mass, in its unity, in its cohesion. It is only based on those qualities that the armed struggle can have effective value. The armed struggle will always be important, separate from the mass of the proletariat. It is for that reason that this task does not devolve on special groups which come into existence in isolation from the proletarian masses, but are part of the general tasks of the workers' groups and should be carried out only by them. The struggle of the workers' groups which will confront the National Front and the fronts of the imperialisms with the workers' front is part of the preparation of the factory committees and the Soviets whose hour will soon sound." End quote. In a special issue of May 1944, La Vérité had a lead article attacking the call of the Algiers-based Committee of National Liberation of Charles de Gaulle for a national uprising with the coming opening of the Second Front in France. It charged that, among other things, the, quote, national insurrection, end quote, called for by de Gaulle was designed, quote, to prevent the rising of German soldiers against their officers and the union of revolutionary German soldiers with the workers of the occupied countries, end quote. Rather, this article said, the Trotskyists, quote, call on the workers to struggle for themselves, to conquer bread, freedom, peace. Only the working class, allied with the peasant workers and the intellectual workers, can assure bread by the planned and socialist organization of production. Only it can assure freedom by the powers of the workers' and peasants' committees. The Soviets, only it can assure peace by installing the United Socialist Soviet States of Europe and the world. End quote. The special issue of La Vérité of August 11, 1944, put out when the Allies were approaching Paris, was in the form of a two-sided throwaway of the PCI. It called for support of a general strike. It claimed the underground CGT had called. On the backside, under the heading, "So that the defeat of Hitler is the victory of the workers," the paper launched the slogans, quote, "Open the prisons and camps, arm yourselves, form your workers' militias in enterprises and neighborhoods, occupy your enterprises, elect your delegates as in June 36, end quote. At the bottom of the second page of this issue were two short passages to, quote, Deutsche Soldaten, end quote, and, quote, Allied soldiers, end quote. The latter read, in English, quote, "We want to overthrow capitalism and take the power for the working class. This, our struggle, is yours too." It's the only way to help English and American workers, to win best wages for them and you. Don't break our struggle. Don't shoot at us. Long life to the International Brotherhood. Long life to the Shop and Soldiers Committee. Long life to socialist peace, end quote. The August 21st, 1944 issue of La Vérité carried an open letter of the PCI to the French Communist Party and the Socialist Party. It urged a pact of, quote, unity of workers' action, end quote. There is no indication that either of the large parties took any notice of this, quote, letter, end quote. Clearly, the French Trotskyists regarded the, quote, maquis, end quote, as being merely supplementary to the principal resistance struggle, which they saw as being in the factories and other workplaces. They in no way regarded the Allied troops which landed in Normandy as, quote, liberators, end quote, but rather as an army seeking to supplant one imperialism for another insofar as France and Europe in general were concerned. René Dazi has noted the very limited success and ultimate failure of the Trotskyists in their effort to organize embryonic Soviets. He has written that, quote, after the 17th of August, following the liberation of Paris, workers' committees were born in the Jumeau factories of BMW of Argenteuil, where the Trotskyists had good positions. The movement included several dozen enterprises of the Parisian region, ... The majority of these committees were confused with trade union committees, that is, the CGT. Some were directed by the Trotskyists, who gave leadership to an inter-enterprise committee and an inter-militia liaison committee of 40 workers, large and small, of the western suburbs. Those committees, spontaneously arising from the rank and file, had a scent of Sovietism, ... Thus the PCF and CGT dedicated themselves to restrain the powers of the factory committees, to finally make them play only the simple role of enterprise committees, which the law of 22nd of February 1945 officialized, end quote. Some Trotskyists also participated in the armed resistance. In doing so, however, they were clearly faced with disagreeable alternatives. The part of the resistance run by professional military men had little attraction for them, and the more, quote, popular, end quote, parts of the Maquis were usually dominated by the communists, and this meant that the Trotskyists either had to hide their own true beliefs and feelings or run the risk of being eliminated physically by the communist leadership of the guerrilla groups. Rodolphe Prager has explained the attitude of the Trotskyists toward the resistance and their relationship to it. He wrote that, quote, the Trotskyists opposed the Popular Front, the strongest reason why they could not join the National Resistance Front, which included groups from the most reactionary to the parties of the left and supported the cause of the Allied imperialists, ... Practical agreements were, on the other hand, conceivable and took various forms on the local and national level. They concerned exchange of information and practical aid, end quote. Prager added that, quote, in addition, the comrades participated on an individual basis in the organizations of the resistance, either because they had lost contact with the Trotskyists or in accord with the Trotskyist organizations. These comrades generally had to hide their quality as Trotskyists, particularly when they worked in organizations under Stalinist influence, where their lives would have been in danger. But I repeat, during the occupation, that was not a subject of debate, ... end quote. Trotskyist martyrs. For a very small group, the French Trotskyists suffered very severe casualties during World War II. A more or less official list of their dead contains 34 names. These include leading figures in the movement, such as Henri Molinier, killed in the fighting for Paris in 1944, and Marcel, murdered in a German concentration camp. In addition to those murdered, at least another 25 members of the French Trotskyist movement were sent to German concentration camps, and another 50 or more Trotskyists were jailed for longer or shorter periods between 1939 and 1944. Both major French factions suffered casualties. As the larger of the two, the POI was more severely affected. It has been noted that, quote, the POI underwent 4 repressive waves of particular severity, that of the leadership in the southern zone, Tresso, Demazière, Bloch, Sedek, etc., that of August 1942 in the Parisian region, Corvin, Barthélemy, Thielen, that of the 6th of October 1943, affecting simultaneously the leadership of the party, Hick, Rousset, Filiat, and the Breton region, Crau, Beaufrère, Trevien, Barthomé, Baudin, etc., and the last, in March 1944, Maurice and René Laval, Marguerite Matière, Pauline Cargemon, etc. End quote. Not, nor were all of these people victims of the Nazis. The Stalinists on occasion were equal to the Nazis in their persecution and elimination of Trotskyists. The most notorious case of suspected Stalinist liquidation of Trotskyists was that of Pietro Tresso, an Italian Trotskyist aligned with the POI, Jean Riboul, Maurice Segal, and Abraham Sadek. The first two had been arrested along with Albert Demasier by the Vichy authorities when they broke up the POI organization in Marseille. The other two had been arrested at other times. All five of these Trotskyists ended up at the prison at Puy en Velay. On the night of October 1st to 2nd, 1943, that prison was raided by a Maquis group, and all the political prisoners were liberated. The five Trotskyists were part of a group which joined the Maquis camp at Wedley. There they were segregated and subjected to, quote, quarantine, end quote, by the Stalinist leaders of the Maquis. A few days later, Albert Demasier was sent with two other men on a food search mission, and Demasier ended up in Paris, where he rejoined his Trotskyist comrades. The other four Trotskyists at the Waldy camp were never heard of again. After the war, the Trotskyists tried vainly to ascertain what had happened to them. René Dazy has summed up the results of this inquiry. Quote, "We have in this history a good example of the conspiracy of silence. 4 suspects under surveillance and submitted to forced labor before the eyes of all disappeared without leaving a trace, and 70 men closed their eyes to the circumstances of their disappearance. As the photos of leaders made victims of purges are erased, 4 people were erased from their memories." ... End quote. Conclusion. At the end of the Second World War, most of the French Trotskyists were reunited in a new Parti Communiste Internationaliste. United, they still amounted to no more than a few hundred dedicated people. They had been totally unable to convert the international war into a civil war, as their doctrine called for. Quite contrary to their own expectations, not they, but the traditional socialist and communist parties emerged as the major organizations of the left, and the Trotskyists remained, at best, a fringe group.